Hello again, geographers. It's time to talk about whether we can slow climate change, and I sure as heck hope that we can do that. Okay, some learning goals for you all today. You're going to know what actions have been taken to slow climate change. So we're going to look at what the world's already done, and you're going to know what actions need to be taken to slow climate change. Okay, there's a certain level of inertia, lack of action going on internationally on climate change. But we're going to delve a little bit into what should or what needs to be done. And we're going to give you a little activity where you have to problem solve. We'll see how that goes. First up, just randomly, I wanted to show you a couple of graphs showing the carbon dioxide level. So this is thousands of years before today. So I'll give you a couple of moments to interpret that graph yourself. So on the vertical, the up-down axis, we've got CO2 parts per million, so that's how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. On the horizontal, the left-right axis, we've got time before now. So on the right-hand side, we've got 0, that's 0 thousands of years before today. And this graph goes all the way back to 400,000 years ago. Now, the first question I asked when I saw this is, how do they know how much carbon dioxide there was in the atmosphere 400,000 years ago, for crying out loud? I can't remember what I had for breakfast. The reason why they know this is because they drill into the ice cores in the Arctic and the Antarctic, and ice gets laid down through snow and other means every year, and they can calculate how far back they are. So they drill really, really deeply in these ice packs. They can drill down to a kilometre, and they can calculate how far back it went. So, but basically, the thing to take away from this graph is that the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere currently hasn't been this high for well over 400,000 years. Yeah. So in 1950, it was about as high as it was 325,000 years ago. You can see, yep. But now look where we are. Hello. Not good times. What does carbon dioxide have to do with temperature, I hear you ask? Well, as you can see from this graph, the line in red is the temperature. Obviously it goes up and down considerably, and the line in blue is carbon dioxide. And what you can see over the last 1,000 years, there's a pretty strong correlation between how much carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere and the temperature. That's because carbon dioxide traps heat. The more carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere, the more heat is trapped in the atmosphere, and the higher the average temperature is. The average temperature has gone up by about 1 degree since the start of the Industrial Revolution. The start of the Industrial Revolution, as I'm sure you can all remember from your history studies, was about here, right? And from there, this is when we started burning a whole heap of fossil fuels and putting heaps of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that's when you see that carbon level go nuts. Okay, let's take a few notes here, people. So write everything that you see in white down in your exercise book. So what actions have been taken? So climate change is an international problem. Carbon doesn't care what country you're in, so unless international cooperation is taken, it's not going to make any difference. So we need all the countries in the world, especially the wealthy ones and the high polluting ones, to help solve the problem. So the first big international agreement to slow greenhouse gas emissions was called the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto is a city in Japan. That's where they made the agreement. And they made some agreements about how to slow greenhouse gases being pumped out. That agreement ended in 2015. In 2015, they had a big conference, the Paris conference, where we agreed to limit temperature rise to 2 degrees. Okay, so we were like, yeah, if the temperature gets to 2 degrees, the problem is with temperature increase and climate change is that past a certain point, the environment is going to start cranking up climate change by itself. We're not going to need to do anything. So like, for example, if the average temperature goes up enough in the Arctic Circle, right at the top of the Earth, right, there's no land underneath the Arctic. There is underneath the Antarctic, But underneath the Arctic, it's just ice. So once that ice melts, there's dark sea below it. Now, if you've ever worn a black t-shirt on a hot day, you know that dark things absorb more heat, okay? So currently, with the Arctic Circle, we've got this massive big white thing on the top of the Earth, whoosh, rebounding all of that heat back out into space. Now, if, as what scientists think is going to happen in the next 50 years, the Arctic completely melts, then instead of having this big white thing bouncing all that heat back off, we're going to have a dark ocean, which is going to absorb heat in. There's also quite a lot of frozen wastelands called the tundra in northern Russia that if they warm up and defrost, then all of the carbon that was stored in those soils and in plants will get released into the air. The point is that past a certain point, we're going to have a runaway train problem. So we really need to limit the temperature rise. It's already risen just over 1 degree, remember? We need to limit it to, scientists reckon we need to limit it to about 2, and in fact, we're probably more like actually 1.5. So that's what the Paris conference tried to do. Everybody went, yeah, we'll sign up to that, and everybody agreed, promised that they wouldn't release certain emissions so that the temperature wouldn't go up by 2 degrees. However, there's no enforcement. Now, if you think about, if you've ever played a game, if there's a rule in that game, but there's no punishment for breaking that rule, then are people going to follow that rule? You know, there's a lot of countries and companies that have a lot of interest in continuing to pump out pollution because they make money from it. So if they're told, yeah, don't do it, but if you don't follow these rules, nothing bad will happen, are they going to follow that? It's the big question. That's the big weakness with this Paris conference. Okay, so to try and limit greenhouse pollution, Australia brought in a carbon tax in 2011. It reduced pollution by 7% in just 3 years. So the carbon tax was working. Now, during the period of 2011 to 2014, a lot of people said, oh, it's going to destroy the economy, it's going to destroy the economy. It didn't. However, in 2014, when a new government came along, they cancelled the carbon tax. And Australia, still to this day, is the only country in the world that has ever put a carbon tax in and then gotten rid of it. So, congratulations. Not. Right. So, going back to that agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, which, remember, has run out 5 years ago, ran out in 2015. These are all the different emissions targets for different countries. So everybody had different negotiating powers, and it would take me a million years to explain why all these numbers are so different, but every country negotiated a different number that they would need to reduce their emissions by, right? So the EU decided, yeah, we can reduce our emissions by 8%. Germany, which has a lot of renewable energy and is quite a forward-thinking country, was like, yeah, we'll reduce it by 21%. That's quite big. A couple of countries who are like, yeah, we're still developing, like China and India, were like, yeah, well, we're just going to keep ours the same, or not even be involved. But check out Australia. Under Kyoto, they said that they had negotiated to still be allowed to increase their emissions by 8%. And this is in an international treaty that's trying to reduce carbon emissions across the world. Australia is usually seen as a pretty good international citizen, but in terms of the environment, especially when it comes to climate change, it's not looked on very well anymore. Sad. Here's a lot of a whole big group of politicians here getting all excited after the end of the 2015 Paris Climate Change Agreement, where they made all these promises that they would reduce carbon emissions to stop or slow climate change. In the 5 years since that has happened, unfortunately, because there's no punishments if you don't follow what you promised, it hasn't been that successful. Surprise, surprise. So with all this depressing news, how can we reduce GHG, greenhouse gas emissions? And remember the 3 main greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, it's the one you hear about the most, methane, mostly from livestock, and nitrous oxide, mostly from various industrial processes. Okay, the big one. This is what international governments can do. Emissions trading scheme. It's a market system with a tradable pollution permit. So what you do is you go, okay, work out how much everybody's polluting at the moment. You go, okay, you've got a certificate to pollute that much. Everybody's got their certificates, right? If you can find a way to pollute less, you can then sell your pollution certificate to someone else and make some money. That gives companies a monetary incentive to reduce their pollution. They think, if I reduce my pollution, I'm going to earn money from selling my pollution certificates to someone else. Now, with an emissions trading scheme, you have these tradable pollution permits, but then what you do over time is you slowly reduce the number of permits, and that reduces the world amount of pollution. The benefit to this system is that it will ideally it will find where it's cheapest to reduce emissions. So say company A could reduce its pollution by 1%, but it's going to cost them $1 billion. This company over here can reduce by 1%, it's only going to cost them $1 million. Well, this company should do it, and these guys could maybe pay them some money to help them reduce it. It doesn't matter who reduces their pollution, it just matters that the total amount comes down. Okay. Now, that first one I gave you was something that governments and that can do, and that would be done at the international level. Most of the next ones I'm going to talk about are more at the personal level. So energy efficiency, we can have, this is assuming that your energy is produced by fossil fuels. If your energy is produced by fossil fuels, then you want to use it more efficiently so that you don't burn as much fossil fuels and therefore pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So if we have more energy efficient light bulbs and fridges and TVs, blah, 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 that's all good. Now remember the bar graph from last lesson though, reducing your, swapping to better light bulbs is great. It's about that much impact compared to like going on an international flight though, okay? Not saying that switching to energy efficient light bulbs isn't good. Of course it's good, just like having renewable, reusable grocery bags is good, but it's not going to make a huge difference compared to some other stuff that we could do. Anyway, another thing we could do is use renewable energy. So solar power, wind power, wave power, geothermal power. There's a lot of, some estimates suggest that the sun pumps out enough energy in about 8 hours to power the earth for the whole year. So we just need to harness that. Harness that. What else have we got here? Transport. In transport, we could use public transport more often rather than driving. Public transport has 30 people in a bus rather than 1 people in a car. We could walk. Doesn't use energy, doesn't use any fossil fuels at all. Or we could cycle. Now, that only works if you live in a community where it's possible to walk or cycle. A lot of the new growth suburbs in Melbourne, for example, such as Greenvale, aren't really set up for you to be able to walk or cycle to anywhere interesting. Anyway, fly less. Flying is really bad. It puts, not only does it pump out a lot of greenhouse gases, but it puts them right into the atmosphere, right way up high. So flying is really, really bad for climate change. We could use electric cars more. So there are a few electric cars that are coming to Australia now, but if the government made policies favouring electric cars rather than big gas guzzling SUVs, which are quite common in Australia, then that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well. We could have more fuel efficient cars, and that means cars that don't burn as much petrol in the first place. We could eat less meat. So the animal industry, because it takes quite a lot of land to grow meat, that means cutting down a lot of forests. Forests are really good because they suck in CO2. And there's a lot of other reasons why eating less meat is good for climate change. You just have to take my word on that. I'm not going to go on about that because I'm a vegan. I don't want to be too opinionated. Anyway. And we could plant new forests, yeah. In lots of areas where there's disused land or forests that have been cut down, we could plant new forests. Trees are made from carbon. They suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and pump out oxygen. So not only do they suck carbon out of the atmosphere, which is good for climate change, they pump oxygen into the atmosphere, which is the stuff that we breathe. So trees, go trees, love you. and we could compost. So some estimates suggest that in Australia up to 40% of what you put in your red bin that goes out into landfill is organic food scraps. Now, most of that doesn't really decompose very well in landfill because it's surrounded by metal and brick and wood, blah, 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 blah. If every single family had a compost bin, their amount of stuff that they put into landfill in the first place would be way less, and they would be turning all those food scraps just back into healthy soil. So please compost. It's awesome. I think this is hilarious. You know, there's been quite a few people over the years saying, oh, climate change isn't real. Meh. But even if it's not, all of these things that would also reduce climate change are objectively a good idea. It's activity time. Yeah. Remember, it's all about problem solving. So what I want you to do, I want you to list 2 things that could be done at each scale to reduce carbon emissions. Hey, there's one of those geography concept words. Scale. Sweet. So what could you do at the personal level? I want you to list 2 things that you personally, not in a fantasy world, but that you personally could do now to reduce your carbon footprint. I want you to list 2 things that our school could do to reduce its carbon footprint. You'll notice that these things would probably be quite different. What could your entire suburb, so what could your local government do to reduce carbon emissions at the suburb level? What could Australia do at the national level? What could our whole country do to reduce carbon emissions? And finally, what could the international, what could be done internationally to reduce carbon emissions? Now, you'll notice that as you go further down that list, at the larger scale, the things that you're going to do to reduce carbon emissions are going to have a bigger impact. But, you know, to tackle climate change, things are going to need to change at the personal level, at the school and work level, at the suburb level, at the national level, at the international level. Yeah, we can't do it just with one level. It's got to be all levels. It's a big issue. But you know what? Humans are problem-solving machines, and so are you. So I can't wait to see the kinds of things that you come up with to reduce carbon emissions. Okay, Leonardo Dicaprio, the famous and handsome actor, was made special envoy to the United Nations on climate change, and he spent a year or 2, maybe a year, going around the whole world learning about climate change. He also made a really interesting documentary about it called Before the Flood, which you might get a chance to watch. Anyway, at the end of that year, at a United Nations Climate Summit in New York, he gave this speech. Check out the man bun.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests. I'm honored to be here today. I stand before you not as an expert, but as a concerned citizen, one of the 400,000 people who marched in the streets of New York on Sunday, and the billions of others around the world who want to solve our climate crisis. As an actor, I pretend for a living. I play fictitious characters, often solving fictitious problems. I believe that mankind has looked at climate change in that same way, as if it were a fiction, as if pretending that climate change wasn't real would somehow make it go away. But I think we all know better than that now. Every week we're seeing new and undeniable climate events, evidence that accelerated climate change is here right now. Droughts are intensifying, our oceans are acidifying, with methane plumes rising up from the ocean floor. We are seeing extreme weather events and the West Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets melting at unprecedented rates, decades ahead of scientific projections. None of this is rhetoric, and none of it is hysteria. It is fact. The scientific community knows it, industry knows it, governments know it, even the United States military knows it. The chief of the U.S. Navy's Pacific Command, Admiral Samuel Locklear, recently said that climate change is our single greatest security threat. My friends, this body, perhaps more than any other gathering in human history, now faces this difficult but achievable task. You can make history, or you will be vilified by it. To be clear, this is not about just telling people to change their light bulbs or to buy a hybrid car. This disaster has grown beyond the choices that individuals make. This is now about our industries and our governments around the world taking decisive, large-scale action. Now must be our moment for action. We need to put a price tag on carbon emissions and eliminate government subsidies for oil, coal, and gas companies. We need to end the free ride that industrial polluters have been given in the name of a free market economy. They do not deserve our tax dollars. They deserve our scrutiny, for the economy itself will die if our ecosystems collapse. The good news is that renewable energy is not only achievable, but good economic policy. This is not a partisan debate, it is a human one. Clean air and a livable climate are inalienable human rights. And solving this crisis is not a question of politics, it is a question of our own survival. This is the most urgent of times and the most urgent of messages. Honored delegates, leaders of the world, I pretend for a living, but you do not. The people made their voices heard on Sunday around the world, and the momentum will not stop. But now it is your turn. The time to answer humankind's greatest challenge is now. We beg of you to face it with courage and honesty. Thank you.
Our second video today is from Sweden's Greta Tunberg. She is a girl who, when she was 16, staged a one-person climate strike out the front of the Swedish Parliament. She wagged school for a day, sat out there by herself in the cold, it's always cold in Sweden, and protested about climate change, saying, you know, look, I'm young, I'm the person who's going to have to live through climate change. What you guys are doing is not good enough. And within the next year, she became massively popular. The school strikes for climate happened all around the world. You know, I think that of any group that should be stressing about climate change, it's young people, because you guys are going to be the ones that have to live through it. Anyway, she also gave a speech to the United Nations, and this is it. It's if tears don't well up in your eyes watching this, then you're not human. Check her out.
Greta, your first climate strike was a lonely event a little over a year ago, and in the intervening time, you have sparked the interest of millions, literally, of children around the globe, demanding action for climate change. What's your message to world leaders today?
My message is that we'll be watching you. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that. Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe. The popular idea of cutting our emissions in half in 10 years only gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees and the risk of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. 50% may be acceptable to you, but those numbers do not include tipping points, most feedback loops, additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution, or the aspects of equity and climate justice. They also rely on my generation sucking hundreds of billions of tons of your CO2 out of the air with technologies that barely exist. So a 50% risk is simply not acceptable to us, we who have to live with the consequences. To have a 67% chance of staying below a 1.5 degrees of global temperature rise, the best odds given by the IPCC, the world had 420 gigatons of CO2 left to emit back on January 1st, 2018. Today, that figure is already down to less than 350 gigatons. How dare you pretend that this can be solved with just business as usual and some technical solutions? With today's emissions levels, that remaining CO2 budget will be entirely gone within less than 8.5 years. There will not be any solutions or plans presented in line with these figures here today, because these numbers are too uncomfortable and you are still not mature enough to tell it like it is. You are failing us, but the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you. We will not let you get away with this. Right here, right now, is where we draw the line. The world is waking up, and change is coming whether you like it or not. Thank you.
Okay, this is a totally wacky activity. It's called the worst response in the world. I want you to think, what would be the worst response in the world to the threat of climate change? I want you to answer that. Give me 3 or 4 sentences. You know, if we were just like, climate change, what would be the worst thing that the world could do in response to this challenge? Hey, thank you so much for taking part in this lesson. Don't ever stop keeping it real.